Saint Thomas and his voyage to India. Now let's look at Saint Thomas' visit to our country, his first visit and the second one. What brought him to India and how these trips laid the foundation of Christianity in Indian subcontinent. The usual route from Alexandria to India was the one from Alexandria down the Nile by Memphis and from there through the Red Sea to Ochelis, Cana and then to Baruch. Therefore, the first port where Thomas landed in India was Baruch. Baruch was the most important seaport of India at that time. As it was on the mouth of Narmada river in the state of Gujarat, all the ships to India landed at this port. The Christians of Baruch, who had great affection for the apostle, bears witness to his mission. The Christians of Versailles still holds on to some of the St. Thomas traditions, and they are also being seen as remnants of early Christians influenced by St. Thomas in his first voyage. The same can be said about the ancient Christian communities of Thana, Sopara, today called as Nalasopara, etc. From Baruch, the apostle followed the route through Ujjain to Taxila. Following this highway, the apostle finally reached Taxila, the kingdom of Gondafar. Even today, we can see Christian symbols in the communities of St. Thomas tradition in Udaipur and Ujjain. The Christian communities of St. Thomas tradition that existed at Ujjain in Madhya Pradesh and Christian symbols discovered at Ujjain prove the visit of the apostle in these places. It seems that there were Christians at Taxila in today's Afghanistan in the 1st century AD. Gundafar between AD 19 to 45 had established a kingdom of its own by conquering what we today know as Afghanistan, Pakistan and Punjab in the 1st century. This area was known as Indo-Parthian Kingdom in its capital in Taxila. Archaeological excavations in the Indo-Parthian regions since the last century have brought to light several coins bearing the image and inscription of Gundafar. These discoveries agrees with the details in the description of the king associated with the Indian mission of St. Thomas. From Taxila, St. Thomas seems to have returned to Jerusalem through the overland route, the famous Silk Route. There are various traditions regarding the journey of St. Thomas to Jerusalem to attend the funeral of Mary, the mother of our Jesus Christ. St. Thomas has described to the other apostles about his mission to the King of India. It seems to be logical to say that St. Thomas was in northwest India and from there he went to Jerusalem following the well-travelled Silk Route. The tradition of St. Thomas in various parts of the Persian Empire may be a result of this voyage from India to Jerusalem and his mission. We know that on those days, the journey through Silk Route was not a non-stop journey from one end to the other. The travellers had to stop at regular intervals and spend a few days or perhaps weeks or even months before they resumed the journey to different parts. After the Jerusalem Council, the Apostle Thomas again set sail for India, the southern part of the country. On this second journey to India, St. Thomas stayed in the island Socotra and preached the gospel there and established a Christian community. Socotra is a small island in the Indian Ocean and is today a part of People's Democratic Republic of Yemen. It was a called port for the voyagers coming to western coast of India. It had also been a considerable Indian colony. The Christian presence in this island from early centuries of Christian era gives an added reason to this theory. The first notice of Christians of St. Thomas in Socotra is given by Cosmos Indico-Polistius, who wrote in 535 AD about Christians in this island. St. Francis Xavier, 1,000 years later, spoke of the nominal presence of Christians in Socotra. According to him, they claimed to be the Christians of Saint Thomas. Further from Socotra, Saint Thomas travelled towards India and reached Muziri in 52 AD. The apostle established Christian communities in 7 different places in Kerala. The 7 churches or Edarappalligal: Kodungalur, Kollam, Niranam, Nilakkal, Kokamangalam, Kottakkavu, Palayur and Thiruvankod Arappalli, a half church. All these churches where Saint Thomas is said to have established communities are now strong Christian centers. As we learn from the traditions in Malabar, after establishing these 7 communities in Malabar, the apostle went over to the Coromandel coast. Before parting, he had appointed presbyters and deacons, and they, in their turn, appointed their successors. As for the St. Thomas Christians, to keep its unity, it had to have relation with the church in other centers as well. Hence, on appeal from the St. Thomas Christians, the Catholicos of East sent to Kerala in AD 345 Bishop Uraha Mar Yusuf and 4 priests, and the relation continued until the Portuguese arrival. The Rambanpattu, which summarizes the traditions of Malabar regarding the mission of our Saint Thomas, narrates that before crossing over to the Coromandel coast, the apostle had already strengthened the communities by ordaining bishops and priests for them. It was after ordaining bishops and priests for these 7 communities in Malabar that the apostle travelled to the Coromandel coast in the Chola kingdom. Because of the persecutions, the Christians from these churches migrated to different places like Angamali, Pallipuram, Ambalakkadu, Arivittara, Kaduturuthi, etc. towards the 1st century. From the Coromandel coast, Saint Thomas journeyed to China sometime after AD 65, where he stayed for a few years and preached the gospel. China had held commercial contacts with the eastern coast of India for a long time, and this trade was at a brisk pace in the 1st century AD. Saint Thomas went to China from Mylapore in Madras, and he returned back to Mylapore about 67 AD. Saint Thomas embraced his martyrdom in AD 72 while he was in Mylapore. There are 2 versions about how the apostle was martyred. According to the apocryphal act of Thomas, he was stabbed to death on a hill outside the city at the order of the Chola king. The king was infuriated by his wife's vow of abstinence, a vow influenced by the teaching of our Saint Thomas. In a version of Rambanpattu, the Chola king appears as a person who arranges for a royal burial for the apostle. In the second version, it is said that some Brahmin at the little mount at Mylapore forced the apostle to worship their goddess. Saint Thomas not only refused but challenged him. The enraged Brahmins stabbed him to death with a lance while praying in front of the cross. Saint Thomas was given a royal burial in the words of the author of the Acts of Thomas. And all the brethren wept, and they brought beautiful robes and much and fair linen, and buried him in a royal tomb wherein the former kings were laid. A pot containing earth moistened by his blood and the lance with which he was pierced were both buried in his tomb. The ancient tomb at Mylapore in southern India is unanimously and consistently ascribed to Saint Thomas. Because of this widespread fame of the tomb of Thomas, the Portuguese missionaries were very particular to identify it. They found a small shrine called Betuma, that is, the house of Thomas, in the custody of a Muslim. They excavated the site between 1523 and 1524 and confirmed that the traditional belief that the apostle had been buried in a royal tomb. The bricks used for the construction of the tomb were very identical with those of the 1st century Roman warehouse at Arikamedu near Mylapore. The Diocese of St. Thomas of Mylapore were erected in 1606 because there lay buried the body of St. Thomas. The name St. Thomas and his inspiring story of the missionary journey evoke the sentiments of pride and devotion in the minds of the faithful who belong to the Church of St. Thomas tradition. More about the tradition and practice of St. Thomas Christians we'll see in the next episode. Keep watching.